Welcome to our review on preventing infections. When we're talking about all of these possible communicable diseases, then there are steps that we can actually take to make it less likely that we're going to be infected by anything and everything in the world. And some of these are pretty simple. So the first thing we're actually going to consider is hopefully something you employ in your everyday life. If you don't yet, maybe start. And that is having basic hygiene techniques. So it's things like washing your hands, particularly after you've been to the toilet, but definitely before you're preparing food, eating food. All of this is going to make sure that you're not contaminating the food with whatever may be on your hands. When you're coughing and sneezing, then cover your mouth and nose. We've seen the impact of droplet infection, so let's try to stop that just erupting into the air around you all the time. And ideally you're doing that with a tissue that can be thrown away rather than just coughing and sneezing all over your hands and then wiping it on your books or surfaces. We can also use disinfectants in order to obviously clean those surfaces and kill any microorganisms that may be present on them. And it's on the basics of your food hygiene. So don't put your raw meat next to the food that you're going to eat uncooked, because that just encourages that cross-contamination. If we've got someone who has been infected with a very contagious disease, then ideally we need to isolate them. Because if we isolate someone who is incredibly contagious, that's going to reduce the people they come into contact with and hopefully stop it spreading. And a good example of this is in the outbreaks of things like Ebola. So this is where we take anyone who's infected away from those that are not infected to stop it spreading amongst the healthy population. And if we've got a scenario where medical professionals need to have contact with them, then they need to wear appropriate protective clothing. And you can see what that means for an Ebola outbreak, that they're sort of head to toe in protective gear there. So not only have they got the protective suits, you can see that the gloves that they're wearing have been taped so that there's no gaps there. They're wearing a mask, they're wearing goggles over their eyes, and even very thick boots, just to avoid any contact whatsoever. The third one is how we can actually control these diseases that are spread by vectors. Now, a vector is an organism that's going to transmit a pathogen from one host to the next. And the example we've already mentioned is the mosquito, which transmits malaria. If we've got a technique that will allow us to control the vector, we can control the spread of that particular disease that's transmitted by that vector. So with our mosquitoes and malaria, we could do something as simple as making sure we sleep under a mosquito net. We could remove any bodies of sitting water so that the mosquitoes can't breed there. If it's a tick-borne disease like Lyme disease, then you can just make sure that if you're walking through long grass that you're not wearing shorts, which will just encourage them to bite you. So wear long trousers at that point to keep them off your skin. And if you're in any countries with rabies, for example, no matter how cute those animals are, don't go up and try and pet them. Because if they scratch or bite you and they happen to be carrying rabies, then you're gonna get rabies, and you do not want those injections to stop you getting full-blown disease symptoms. The next thing that we can do is to use vaccinations. Now, the whole idea of having vaccination programs is to provide immunity to the population to certain pathogens that can be very problematic to our health. It's not just about humans and protecting us from the big bad world of disease. We also need to be mindful of those diseases that are spreading through plants and animal populations, because we're actually quite reliant on them for life. And one of the key ways that we do rely on them is through our agriculture and farming programs. So if a farmer identifies a disease, then they might take a few steps to try to limit the spread of that disease. The first is, if it's a plant, then they can burn the diseased plant material, because if you burn it, you destroy it. If we've got animals with a certain disease, then we could either treat them with drugs if there are drugs available. Otherwise, as we saw with the foot and mouth outbreak a few years ago, there's a mass slaughter of the herd. We can restrict the movement of livestock in order to prevent things spreading from one region to another. And when we're looking at entering any of these areas, we can use chemical dips that will kill any pathogens on footwear. So you can see the sort of outcome, if you like, of the foot and mouth outbreak that we had a few years ago. So at the top, we've had all these signs that were actually telling people that certain areas were off limits due to the outbreak. And when you used to go into some of those areas that people had to still pass through, then you did have those chemical dips in order to clean the footwear so you weren't spreading it into those areas. And at the bottom, unfortunately, that's a scene of a herd of cattle that's been slaughtered and is then being burnt to try to prevent it spreading elsewhere. Hopefully at the end of this video you can talk about the ways that we can reduce these pathogens from spreading from one organism to another.